Welcome to the second session of the Vital Village Networks for Opportunity for Child Wellbeing 2022 webinar series, Levers of Change in Action, Unpacking the Now Playbook. Through this three-part series, we'll hear from Now Network leaders and others who are applying the levers of change outlined in the Now Playbook in their communities. To continue this series, we'll hear from two phenomenal leaders who are working to foster, advance, and promote sustainable community leadership in their daily practices. As we begin our time together, I'd like to acknowledge that we are continuing to strengthen our language justice practices, and this webinar series will be in Spanish with interpretation services provided by the Community Language Cooperative based in Colorado. I'd like to pause now to take a moment to allow our interpreter, Astrid, to share a message with you.
Hello, thank you so much. Hello, thank you so much for having me here today. I am your interpreter for today. My name is Astrid, and we will do this through simultaneous interpretation. I am with, like was mentioned, Community Language Cooperative, and we are promoting language justice, which means that we can all talk in the language of our hearts. I would like to share with everyone a few technical instructions so we can use the interpretation function. Once the interpretation function is turned on, you will be able to see in the bottom of your screen a globe icon. Click on it. When you click on it, you will be able to see the different channels. As you can see on the screen right now, you'll be able to choose between English or Spanish. You can also mute the original audio if you don't want to hear two languages going on at the same time. Please choose a channel and stay on it so you can be connected throughout the whole conference. If you are on a phone or a tablet, then look at the bottom of your screen, the 3 consecutive dots where it says more. And again, you will be able to see the list of channels. Pick your channel once more and stay on it, please. Perfect. Now I'm going to repeat these instructions in Spanish. Hola, muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Astrid Arroyave y voy a ser su intérprete por el día de hoy. Muchísimas gracias por acoger la justicia del lenguaje. La justicia del lenguaje significa que todos podemos hablar en el idioma de nuestro corazón. Para hacerlo, lo haremos a través de la interpretación simultánea. Y me gustaría compartir con ustedes algunas partes técnicas para poder acceder a este servicio. Una vez se encienda la función de interpretación, ustedes podrán ver en la parte de abajo de su pantalla el icono del globo terrestre, como el planeta. Hagan clic allí y así como lo pueden ver en la pantalla en este momento, se va a abrir una cajita donde les van a enseñar los canales de inglés o español. Escojan el canal que deseen y por favor quédense en él durante la conferencia. También van a tener la opción de apagar el sonido original para que no tengan que lidiar con 2 idiomas al mismo tiempo. Si están en una tableta o en un teléfono, por favor vayan a la parte de abajo de sus pantallas y busquen los 3 puntitos consecutivos donde dice more o más. Entonces allí también podrán elegir, otra vez van a ver su cajita de canales y podrán elegir el que más les guste y también podrán silenciar el audio original. Y esto es todo. Muchísimas gracias y ya podemos encender la función de interpretación. This is all. Thank you so much. We can turn on the interpretation function.
Thank you so much, Astrid, and thank you again for being here. At this time, please take a moment to select the language that best suits your need by clicking the globe icon located on the bottom of your Zoom window. You can also follow the instructions on our screen. Again, a special thank you to the Community Language Cooperative for providing us language justice services today. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on the Now Forum within the next few days. I also invite you to submit questions on the dashboard and feel free to use the comments for chat. Our outline for today is we'll spend a little bit of time in our welcome and overview. I'll talk a little bit about Vital Village Networks, and then we'll hear about cooperative practices or cooperatives as a practice of community leadership from Stephanie Waters and Darnell Adams, followed by a panel discussion and audience Q&A. So we encourage you to share questions, as many as you'd like, and then we'll close out today. Again, just want to show you where you can select and submit questions in the chat box using the Q&A icon. Our guests will have the opportunity to share questions or to respond to questions a little bit later in our time together. So I just want to go a little bit further. While many of you have been with us for a while, I'd like to welcome those who may be joining us for the first time and offer a brief overview of Vital Village Networks and Now. We are a collective of change makers committed to pioneering sustainable approaches to transforming child, family, and community well-being. We are rooted in Boston with a broad web of peers and partners across the country, all connected through the networks of opportunity for child well-being, better known as Now. We are bonded through our guiding principles of creating shared spaces for belonging, learning, engaging, and transforming our communities together. And to hear more about our work and share your own stories, we invite you to visit the Now Innovation Forum, where you'll find access to a variety of tools, resources, and stories of leaders working collaboratively to shift what it means for our children, our families, and our communities to thrive. If you have not yet had a chance to download a copy of the Now Playbook, I encourage you to visit the forum after the webinar, of course, to get a copy. The playbook is designed as a living guide to what it means and how it looks to transform community capacity and advance equity. It can be read as a book or used as a reference tool. Either way, it's meant to be read and reread as often as necessary. It is based upon 5 levers of change that we have found integral to community-led change: centering racial equity and healing, implementing shared governance, engaging communities authentically and with dignity, data storytelling, and planning for sustainability. The playbook features stories of what each lever looks like in action from communities across our vast network, key strategies from the village, and helpful tools and resources. Throughout this series, we'll hear more from change makers whose work embodies these levers of change from various angles to uplift and support children, families, and communities. Now, earlier this year, we released a dignity-centered guide to reflecting on cooperative funding structures, a tool developed by a national cooperative design lab group, including one of today's speakers. This guide focuses on reimagining what it would look like for our communities and coalitions to use cooperative structures to receive and disseminate funding. In today's session, you'll hear an outline of the design process and reflections from one of its members, but here's a quick snapshot of some of our core principles and practices. And I don't want to steal anything away from Stephanie, so I want to make sure we leave time for her to share, but this just gives you a brief glance. So I am excited to introduce our 2 speakers today. We'll be hearing from Stephanie Waters of the Young Child Wellness Council and Black Warrior Community Action Teams, as well as Darnell Adams from Firebrand Cooperative. We'll hear from both of them for about 15-ish minutes, and then we'll have time to open it up for questions. So I will invite you then and throughout their conversation as questions come up to share in the chat box and using the Q&A button. But without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Stephanie Waters from the Young Child Wellness Council and Black Warrior Community Action Team to get us started.
Okay, Thank you, Rhonda, for that introduction. I was really excited to be part of this design lab process. Just a little bit of history with my work with the Young Child Wellness Council and the Black Warrior Community Action Team. We are housed in Western Alabama, and it is a very poor region of the state, has some of the lowest markers of child well-being and family well-being, and a lot of work that needs to be done. And so our coalition getting to be part of the Now Learning community was really transformative in how we looked at supporting families and supporting communities, and really having a new view of what authentic family engagement is. And so as we have been trying to take some of these practices back into our community, a lot of these are some new and unfamiliar concepts to people. And we got a little bit of pushback, which has definitely been kind of a growing point. But one of the things that became very clear was that we had a lot of siloing of services and not a lot of collaboration and cooperation in a way that was making as many people as possible. And so when the opportunity came to be part of this design lab, I really jumped at it because the idea of cooperative funding is really very new and different to me. And I thought it had the potential to be something really helpful for our community. And as somebody with a background in special education, while there definitely are some funding issues in our educational system, we don't usually have to go out and look for money to provide the basics for the students. And so really kind of coming out of that setting and into more community work really helped me see how important this would be. So if we can go to the next slide. So when we started the process, there were 15 of us from around the country and from a variety of different programmatic settings. So it was really exciting to hear different perspectives, different barriers, different celebrations that people had. But the one thing that we stood out and we had to keep in mind is that the people who were not there were the people who had the money. And so, but it also gave us an opportunity to really think differently and creatively about, in an ideal world where we as the people really trying to support a community wanted to have access to money, what would it look like? What would be our ideas? And as Rhonda mentioned, the guiding principles of Now, everything that we did was really focused around equity, dignity, and community-centered leadership. And so through this design lab, we started with some webinars and some trainings about what cooperatives are and the history of cooperatives and just that whole process so that we had a good foundational knowledge. And then we really dug into exploring the concept of cooperatives as a model for restructuring the current funding sources that many of us are using, where we're really looking at partnership versus power. Who has the power, who has the money has the power. And so in talking about what the existing structures are and what some of those barriers are, most funding sources really come from a deficit model where you're looking at what do we need to do to fix a certain community, to fix a problem, to fix something that's missing or lacking. And as an educator, I know it's very important for me to look at the strengths that children bring to the table and building those to help them be successful. And so, it just seems kind of natural that we do the same thing with this kind of process as well. We also acknowledge that a lot of our existing structures have really rigid guidelines that are hard to sometimes fit into with the work that we do. And we don't always have the staff capacity to do all of the things in those certain timelines. Next. So we were able to just have this great space to think big, to think without considering the current restrictions of current structures, and even pie in the sky without the people who give the money saying, but. We were just able to throw all of these big ideas out there and really think about what do we see could be such a wonderful way of funding real change, real impactful change within communities. And so what we knew that we would want to see is that it is led by the community, that it really focuses on self-determination, centering the process, the goals, the involvement with the people who are going to use and benefit from the funds. So instead of, an organization thinking, well, this is what I think needs to happen, that we really were having the community lead that decision. It was also really important to focus on relationships, both because of shared power and ownership, so that there was really equal voice, a real democratic decision-making process from everyone who's involved, the community members, as well as the funders. And that the wisdom and knowledge and lived experience of the community had just as much value as the money that was going to go into it. So those were things that we really thought were very important. So as we kind of identified what we would like to see, then we went on to create some guiding principles, and then what would the work look like that would support those principles. Next slide. So the 4 guiding principles that we identified, and again, based on all of these things that we have just discussed, was dignity, that the work was always honoring and upholding the value of that community and the members of the community. Self-determination, as I mentioned, where community leadership was really at the core of everything. Sustainability, because we don't want to just throw some money at a community or at a project that then is not going to be able to stay around and continue to impact that community. And so thinking differently about funding structures and cooperative funding looks at possibility for having that be more sustainable. And then the last was equity, that it's benefiting the community in ways that are identified by them, that are important to them. Again, that community members have just as much power and voice and involvement as the people who are bringing the money to the table, and that it is upholding the dignity of these individuals. And so we identified what are practices that we think are going to support these principles. What's it going to look like? What's it going to take? What are the steps that are involved for that? And again, relationships really came up over and over and over as a key. Relationships in that everybody is committed to that same vision, that everybody is getting and giving something in the process, that it is not a charity project, but that it is a community partnership, and that there is concern for the community, for equal involvement of everybody that's involved with this project. Again, that relationship really being key. And then improvement, it's a responsive process, and that it can change and be fluid as we get into the work and as we see that maybe the process needs to be different. A lot of our current funding sources, as I mentioned, are pretty rigid in how it works, and there either is not the possibility of changing maybe what you originally proposed, or there are so many steps of an oversight that's involved to try to do something a little bit different. And we know that a responsive process, something that's iterative versus rigid, is really going to be where we're going to have the most potential for positive impact. And in talking about dignity and equity, that it's important to acknowledge the history of the community, the generational work that has happened, the culture of that community, and really considering all of those things in the process. And then finally, that what we're doing, the service, the end result, the goal is something that benefits the community in ways that are identified by them and in ways that are important to them. And that is very different than a lot of the work that I have been involved with in the past and a lot of our traditional funding structures. And so really focusing on what the community is wanting. Final slide. So what we did is we took these principles and created a tool that could be used. It could help funders really think deeply about their intentions when funding a project. It also really can help organizations as well clarify their desires from funders. So the guiding questions really are, is an equitable partnership desired? And is community leadership a desired outcome? And these questions can really help both the funders and the organizations kind of get to that. And if they're not matching up, then this can help to identify that this is not going to be an effective relationship and that perhaps something else should be explored. These reflective questions can help bring to the surface maybe some deeper mindsets about what funding projects looks like or should look like, may identify some implicit beliefs that people and organizations have, and then could even begin change in that area. But we really felt pretty excited about creating this tool. We had the opportunity to present it to a group of individuals who provided feedback. But we're just as excited as we were. So here we took these big ideas that we had, and you really wonder if the people who control the purse strings are going to be as excited about these ideas as we were. And we saw that there are people who want this kind of project, who want to be involved in something like this that's going to make real, sustainable, authentic, important change for communities. And so we really hope this tool is going to be something that is going to make an impact for a long time. So thank you.
Stephanie, thank you so much for your remarks. For our guests who are with us, I invite you to add comments to the chat box. Feel free to ask, to go ahead and post questions in our Q&A. After we hear from Darnell, we'll come back and bring folks back to hear for a bit more discussion. So with that, Stephanie, thank you. I'd like to turn it over to Darnell Adams from Firebrand Cooperative to share more about her work and her experience. So Darnell, I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. And I just want to just start with appreciation for everyone who's here, that we're able to spend the time together in this space. I know I consider this, I'll be sharing some of my ideas, but this is a learning opportunity for all of us. And I'm really excited to hear the thoughts and the questions that you have just in a few minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and start with sharing screen, and hopefully the technology all works and this happens in a way that I intend. So let's see. And not sure if that, no, that's
seeing you in edit mode. Perfect, we see it now.
There we go. Fantastic, thank you so much. So I'll just start a little bit about who I am, a little bit how I got to be sitting in the Zoom room with you, and some of the thoughts that I have in the work that I've been doing over the last few years. So my name is Darnell Adams. I'm based in Boston. I am a co-owner of a worker co-op called Firebrand Cooperative. We focus on change management. So specifically for people who are working to change systems. And so we work in concert with folks who are trying to see how to do things differently, and we lend our skills and talents. So that might be through consulting or brand identity. And for me specifically, is focused on facilitation and leadership coaching. So that's who I am, a bit about me anyway. But I want to tell you a little bit about how I got here, which will dovetail into the topic of the day. So I entered into the cooperative world sort of by happenstance. I had a catering business and I was sharing a shared kitchen in Boston. And through that, I had the experience of learning what it could be like, what it is like, to be able to have a shared need. We all were trying to grow a business. None of us were able to afford having a kitchen of our own. And through this nonprofit, we were able to share this space. And I was there for quite a few years. And I won't get into the details of it, but had the opportunity to actually be the managing director of the space for about 5 years, 5+ years. So that's a picture of the kitchen and the types of businesses that were there. This is a tamale business. And as I left, was looking for other things, I was really thinking about this model, and this wasn't a cooperative, but it had certainly aspects of cooperative economics and cooperative behavior. And I was contacted by a group called the Dorchester Food Co-op. Their name changed. This is, they had Dorchester Community Food Co-op, but now it's known as Dorchester Food Co-op. And they were a group of community members who were looking to build a food cooperative in the Bowdoin, Geneva neighborhood of Boston. Historically disinvested community, certainly still dealing with the aspects of redlining that has happened over the decades. And that was my entree into cooperatives. And I learned about cooperatives by organizing in the cooperative space. And those are some of the folks that I met along the way. And in that, I was opened up and learned about the larger cooperative movement here in the US. Here's the picture of a conference called the Up and Coming Food Conference. And this brings together cooperators from across the country, startups that are from Alaska to, Hawaii, to Boston, who are come together to learn together. And in this, I had a much broader idea of all the different types of communities that were building cooperatives, all the different ways they might be going around about their organizing, and all the different things that co-ops were trying to actually address in their particular communities. And we had the space to actually be able to learn together. Over time, as I left that project, it's actually in the middle of being built now, so that is happening. I was able to start Firebrand Cooperative and do consulting, and that also took me to other places. One was joining a group called the Food Cooperative Initiative, which is a nonprofit that supports startup food co-ops across the country, and also being a facilitator for peer groups of people who are learning together how to build a food cooperative in their community. So I am so lucky to be in conversation with about 15 or so food cooperatives or startups across the country, and was able to actually visit a few places along the way. This is the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, who has a 7-acre farm in Detroit, and is now presently building a food cooperative called the Detroit People's Food Cooperative in Detroit. So my line of sight, it kind of went from these kind of cooperative behaviors that people might have to being deeply kind of situated in food cooperative movements across the country. And then so blessed to be able to visit and spend time in Rwanda a couple of months ago, and seeing what cooperative movement looks like there. And these were many of the youth that I got to spend some time with, and there look at things beyond food co-ops. So agricultural co-ops, and a honey co-op, and a goat co-op, and a tofu co-op, mushrooms, you name it, it's going on. And be able to share some of my thoughts. This was, I was asked to present on 5 aspects of dysfunctional teams, because teamwork, as we know in cooperatives, are important. I was asked to share some ideas, and it was translated into Kinyarwanda for the youth that are running the co-ops. So this kind of gives me this view now of an evolving view of co-ops, both as I experienced them in organizing, but also what I'm seeing happening in different communities, and also, luckily, what's happening in Rwanda as well. I want to go back with just the definition of a cooperative, because I do think for what I'm been kind of thinking about and where I think I best support people, is kind of coming back to why a co-op anyway. A cooperative is an autonomous associations of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. And underpinning that definition is 7 principles that are recognized by most co-ops in many parts of the country, many parts of the world. And these 7 principles are really the thing that I have found in many ways, whether people are actually referring to these 7 principles or otherwise kind of solving for the needs of their community, that these things are still held dear. And I do want to speak a bit about, specifically about concern for community, and where I see, as we are kind of moving along to address urgent needs in our community and on our planet, the promise and also the struggle of what I've seen, particularly in the food co-op community, which is in the 90s, and I would say probably in the 90s in particular, it was kind of a cooperative movement, the food cooperative movement, that was really looking at how do we get these sort of mini, I would say mini Whole Foods out there, right? They were solving for kind of organic foods, perhaps, the wishes and needs for a certain part of the community, but not particularly the entire community. And that it became, in my estimation, very narrow and focused in terms of who they considered community and who would be patrons of the food cooperative, who would be members of the food cooperative. What I see now is a shift, certainly from the Black and brown cooperatives that are forming now, which are saying, no, we need to go back to these principles and really think about the needs that we're actually trying to solve for, and broaden the idea of what concern for community actually looks like. And in addressing equity, in addressing access, in addressing power. So that is the movement that I certainly feel like is pushing the envelope of what that kind of 90s style, almost exclusive sort of thing that was happening in cooperatives, particularly in food cooperatives, to saying it's more than time that the focus is different and doesn't have to look like this. And certainly in other countries, it certainly does not. It's not an exclusive thing in the least bit. I want to share just a few things in terms of thinking about the community, the work that goes into a cooperative, and also how that builds community leadership. These are the buckets of work, specifically, and because I'm so situated in food co-ops, it's kind of the normal structure, but these are the buckets of work that a startup working board of a food cooperative have to do. They're generally volunteers. Almost none of them have opened a grocery store nor a food cooperative before. And they have to come together to marshal all their resources to learn about cooperatives, but learn about business, to do community organizing, to actually develop business plans, or get resources to bring people in who can actually consult and help with them. It's an enormous amount of work, and it takes years in the making. But in that process, there's also this ability for the organizers, for the community to build resources, to build knowledge, to build power. And so this work itself, while difficult and hard, outside of just hopefully resulting in a food cooperative, results in this amazing amount of knowledge that can be applied not only to the food co-op, but how you're moving in different ways, speaking to funders, speaking to politicians, whatever it might be. I'll say a little bit more about power and accountability before I close out. Power is important to think about in all systems, I believe. In a food cooperative or many cooperatives, the owners of the cooperatives are the one who hold the power. The board, there's some delegation of that power to the board who is saying, okay, we represent the owners, we're going to be doing this work of the co-op. But the owners are in power. And if there is staff that is being hired, then the board is saying to the general manager, this is what the owners want. This is what you would be doing. And in turn, the co-op staff. And the general manager and a co-op staff, that's going to happen later on, not at a startup. In terms of accountability, though, in terms of staff being accountable, perhaps to the general manager accountable to the board, but ultimately, the folks who are actually have the accountability, who need to know what's going on with the business, who needs to have reports that are coming to the owners. And also in that way, in terms of what community has built, is sometimes a very different way in which they've interacted with, certainly with businesses and all sorts of different entities that never had accountability to community at all. That's me. But I'm going to stop end the show just to say just a few more words about accountability and about funding. The funders that I'm speaking to now, some are definitely realizing that the way that they've been working with cooperatives and other community groups is just not moving the needle, and is actually perpetuating many of the power struggles that have caused the problems to begin with. So I'm all for and very excited that conversations are starting to change in some segments. Sorry about that. I thought the screen share was over. But I do want to leave with this thought from Malik Yakini from the Detroit People Community Food Security Network. So I did an article for the Nonprofit Quarterly that talked about the power of cooperatives, the promise of cooperatives in terms of power, of healing, of dealing with trauma. And one thing that he said, and then I'll leave at this for beginning of the Q&A, is, are the projects that are funded the ones that are trying to make a fundamental shift in power that will ultimately give autonomy and sovereignty to people? Or are they groups that are trying to reform conditions within a system where the people who are in power are still fundamentally in power? Are they still trying to make mega profits and just have a kinder and gentler capitalism? And so funders must have some clear analysis for themselves that this isn't just about minor reforms, but a fundamental shift in power, a fundamental shift in how resources are distributed. And then funders must try to identify those groups that are striving for fundamental changes, as opposed to groups who are just trying to do window dressing reformer things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darnell. Thank you both to Stephanie and Darnell for your remarks. It is my pleasure to invite both Stephanie and Darnell on camera to join me. We'd love to transition and open this space up for question and answers. For our participants, I know a couple of you have started to add some questions or comments, but I invite you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If we happen, we'll try and keep an eye on the chat box too, but feel free to post your questions. I have a couple of questions to start, but would love to take some questions from the audience. So I'll invite you to share your questions as I start with a couple of mine. And so a couple of questions, so much stood out to me from your conversation. And this first question, I think, is for either of you, but maybe we can start with Stephanie. How might a shift towards some of the principles and practices specifically mentioned by you, Stephanie, but also the principles mentioned by Darnell, how might they impact the future of relationships between funders and grantees?
Well, I would think that grantees will really start to feel valued, to feel important, to really feel equal, that it's not just somebody saying, hey, I want to do something that's going to make myself feel better, so I'm going to give you some money because you are needy. Mm-hmm. That's a very othering, that's a very demoralizing kind of feeling, where if somebody has really done the thinking that's in that reflective tool and said, hey, these people are doing work that I see as important, that I see value in, and I want to be part of, then that is empowering for the community, that's empowering for the grantees. And I think that really just starts a real paradigm shift in how we look at that process.
Mm-hmm. Darnell, what might you add?
Yeah, I mean, I think along those lines, in terms of paradigm shift, I think some of that requires no, I know for sure some of that requires real willingness to step into some unknown spaces that can be incredibly scary. And I would say scary for everyone. Mm-hmm. Even if you are a person who is doesn't typically have access to capital and is used to being in relationship to power and to money in a certain way. And I would say actually it's more than just money, it's all sorts of different assets. It requires a kind of broadening of who you think you can be in the world. That's certainly been happening to me along the way. And though I don't come from wealth, I can only imagine, and certainly through some of the conversations with funders, some of them thinking about very radically about their relationship to wealth and power. And how much are they willing, if they're saying they too want paradigm shift, how far are they willing to go?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh, that's really helpful. Stephanie, in your remarks, you mentioned acknowledging history. And I heard you say early on that you were in Alabama. Of course, I happen to know that. But what does it look like in your work around community leadership and partnership? What does it look like to acknowledge the history there? And how has that impacted relationships and trust?
I think that, gosh, that's a hard question. And you probably know some of my thoughts around this, but yes, this is a state that is absolutely burdened with a very difficult history related to racial diversity and so much violence and so much generational trauma. And I've really learned, I mean, okay, let's be honest, people that look like me don't often get into these conversations and don't think about that. And over these last few years, I chuckle, but that's just out of still managing the discomfort and managing the growth that has come from acknowledging that privilege and working towards leveraging that towards real change. So I don't mean to diminish anything with my little nervous chuckle. But even just in my professional work, I've come to realize that people of different races and ethnicities are very skeptical about service providers who don't look like them, are very skeptical about the state and what kind of services are going to offer, what strings are attached, what criticism are going to come with that, what scrutiny is going to come with that. And so, I mean, it is definitely a process that is still ongoing. And I mentioned when our coalition came back from the learning communities, really excited with how new ways of looking at change and community. There are a lot of people involved in services here who are not ready to give up the power that they have or to acknowledge even that they have that power. And so I say all of that because it does impact this whole process. Yeah. And there's a very uneven distribution of wealth, particularly in this area and in this very resource scarce part of Alabama that we live in. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot, there's a lot to unpack related to that. And it's going to be a very slow process. But, we're working, we've created some communities of practice where people are coming together and having some of these difficult conversations and learning to look at themselves differently and therefore being able to look at others differently. And all of that is just part of how we get there. So I think I may have rambled away from your original question.
No, I think it's really helpful to hear, that that's something that you all are grappling with, and would love for us to continue to explore what does that mean for community leadership and partnership and building cooperatives and sustaining them. And I think, Darnell, I have a similar question for you in terms of you've talked about the number of cooperatives that you've been a part of or supported. What are some challenges that you've experienced in these places, in cooperatives and other spaces of shared leadership?
Well, I mean, there's so many different levels. One is, people are people. So I shared that slide or that picture of the 5 dysfunctions of a team in Kinyarwanda, which was a great experience. But here I am kind of talking about some kind of common human things, right? Like, it doesn't matter if I'm in Rwanda or here, in Boston or Alabama, there's a way in which people coming together regardless come together in such a way that sometimes is not moving or move towards the goal in which they say they want, and can actually cause harm in the way that they're behaving. Mm-hmm. So there's like that thing, right, on a personal basis and kind of team basis. And then there's obviously bigger structural issues. There is the fact that kind of learning about cooperatives, and it's many, and I want to actually say that I'm not dogmatic about cooperatives. Mm-hmm. I think cooperatives are one form of ways in which people can come together for a better good. I don't think everyone needs to be in a cooperative or should, but I think cooperative economics, more broadly speaking, is something that I do think has a lot of power. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that the way our educational system is, certainly here, that a lot of people just like me kind of stumble into cooperative economics. It's not readily accessible, and therefore not readily known as a way that you could move certain things forward. Right, so people are using the same old tools, the same old structures, doing the same old stuff with the same results, not knowing and not being familiar with the many different ways that people can kind of use resources together in a democratic fashion. And then I would say, again, we go back to funding, and I say this specifically about food co-ops, because the time that it takes to actually organize and get capital to do a food co-op, that could be years and years. Dorchester has been 10 years to they're actually building now. Is that timeline does not actually meet the needs, particularly if you're talking about food access, of a community right at the second. And so the capital in to be able to do those early stage things, to be able to pay for people in their time and not rely just on volunteers who then, are also juggling their work and all these other things, just stringing on that timeline so long. It's like finding that capital to say, we see what you're doing, we want to fund you now. Shorten the timeline to be able to address the needs of your community.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to the end of our time. And so one question, perhaps a thought I'd like to ask either of you is to perhaps share if there were 2 or 3 final thoughts that you'd like for us, for our audience, to consider, to remember as they're doing this work around whether it's cooperative structures or other avenues of shared and collaborative and cooperative leadership. What might those nuggets be? What's something you'd absolutely want to make sure folks leave understanding today, or at least thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say that the technical skills or knowledge, learning about cooperatives, all of that is there and is done in community. And in some ways, that's the least of it. I think the bigger work is the change of consciousness and heart work that it takes to fundamentally believe and understand that we have a shared destiny together. And there's a sense of urgency to step into that void now. Like, we're all needed to actually shift what is happening on the many different levels that are, that are actually causing the suffering, unnecessary suffering, to a good amount of people on this planet. So it's hard work, even if it's partly technical work too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Darnell. Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that I'm like, yes, exactly. I mean, I think for me, just because things have always been done a certain way doesn't mean that it's the right way or that it has to stay that way. And to quote the amazing Dr. Renee, sometimes you need to just lean into the discomfort and consider the greater good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both so very much. I know we just have a couple of minutes left, and I just want to thank you for sharing your time, your wisdom with us. For our audience, we shared this during the last webinar of this series, but we're trying something new and encouraging you to consider what you're hearing and what actions you might take to advance your own work. So following this session, you'll receive a reflective guide for your personal use to help you sort of unpack what you've heard and how you might apply it to your own practices. And this will be available in both Spanish and English. Again, to Darnell and Stephanie, thank you for joining us today to share how your work in cooperative and collaborative leadership are uplifting the dignity and power of children and families. The work that you are doing is shifting the narrative and shaping a future really designed for all of us to thrive. So we really appreciate that and sincerely appreciate you for joining us. As for our participants, I have a few announcements to share with you. One that I am so incredibly excited about. This year's National Community Leadership Summit will be held virtually October 18th through 19th. We are inviting you to join us to register. Our theme is Crafting Our Legacy, Collaborative Action for Love, Liberation, and Joy. Please visit the Summit website. We can get that linked in the chat box for you to register and learn more. We invite you to share broad and wide with your networks. Finally, just want to thank you again for taking time from your day to join us. We look forward to connecting with you through the forum, through social media, and seeing you soon for the next series or for the next webinar in this series later on this year. Have a wonderful day. Take care of yourselves, take care of your families, your communities. Take care of each other. Thank you, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.